It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Nora. And, you know, as I think about it, Google is one of the most innovative places around. So I guess the question is, why are you folks in Boston and Cambridge? I mean, aren't you supposed to be one of the most innovative places? And isn't this supposed to be a place that's sort of stodgy and it has all this history, but all that history is sort of boring and sort of at the opposite pole, one thinks of, from what Google is about. And so we feel at the Boston History and Innovation Collaborative that Greater Boston is actually one of the most innovative regions, innovative city-states in the world over a length of time, over a century or two. It compares with Edinburgh, with what Venice was once at the time of Marco Polo, with what Shanghai is now and was probably about 100 years ago. Greater Boston really is innovative. And I want to try to juxtaposition some of the, well, it's about the history or it's about the innovation. And we happen to be in an organization which is, as we say, at the corner of history and innovation, a corner that a lot of people don't feel really exists. So let's see whether we can convince you. The culture of Greater Boston, we think, is founded in innovation. And we think that innovation's culture, one of the most important things, is criticizing existing ways of thinking or doing things and coming up with better ways to do that out of that criticism. And what I hope we can do in the next 30 minutes or so, and then there's some time for questions and talking and doing it back and forth, afternoon, is to do two things. First, I'd like to persuade you that the reason that Boston has been and continues to be one of the most innovative in the world is because of this critical way of thinking that it's really embedded in the culture here. And second, I want to convince you that the reason why this area has been able to develop new waves of innovation, and which we're in one of those waves right now and right in this location here, is because of 5 drivers. And our shorthand at the collaborative and with a number of the people that we work with is to call it the bump and connect. I'm going to explain that, but I'm going to try to convince you to the end of this, or by the end of it. And while I'm going to talk about innovation, at the same time, we are not saying that Boston doesn't have baggage. It does have baggage. If you've had, like this area has had, a number of waves of innovation, that wave grows and peaks and then comes down. And when it comes down, there's empty factory buildings, there's empty office buildings, there's empty stores, and there's unemployment. And this area has had some of that. So we're different than Mountain View and Silicon Valley. We're very different. Silicon Valley is an area that its growth, its boomtown sense, that starts in the 30s and a couple of garages of David Packard and Hewlett and other people, and then grows through in what were really fields, green fields, city planners call it or whatever, but green fields, grows in the 50s and the 80s and the 90s and now. That's going to look different. You're not going to feel like you have that baggage that a center of innovation like Boston has if you've had 3 or 4 major waves of that innovation from the past. So you're going to find abandoned and rotting wharfs still a little bit around Boston Harbor, even though it's being changed to housing and other things. And that has something to do with the waves of innovation from the past. So we're also going to take a look at the innovation wave that we're in now and the innovations that have happened right within, let's say, 3/4 of a mile or half a mile of where we're sitting or standing right now in the Kendall Square area. We've studied that as well. So over a decade, our innovation and history collaborative project has worked on accumulating a database of about 400 different major innovations, and innovation being something which has changed the nation or the world, okay? Not just the first in New England, let's say, or the first in the Northeast. It has to be something bigger. And we documented these. These are technological innovations, life sciences innovations, and also social ones. One of the social ones that has to do a lot with networking, the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere and the American Revolution, which started right near here on the other side of the river and on this side of the river here. So let me give you the overview from sort of 10,000 feet up about innovation in this area. And the 4 waves of innovation that have happened after we've had a collapse. Boston, Cambridge, both settled in 1630, both farm towns. The farm economy collapsed in this area 10 years after they settled the place. It had to do with the Civil War in getting rid of the king in England. And a lot of people went back, and all of a sudden, what had been a great real estate flux died, and the people were faced with, do we stay here or leave? People stayed here, the leadership particularly, and reinvented the economy. They changed it from agricultural to shipbuilding and fishing and that sort of area. And in the 1640s and 1650s, they developed some trade routes with the West Indies in particular, a little bit with Spain and a few other places in Europe, and developed an economy here based on this salt cod trade that made this the sort of boom town, the sort of boom economy that San Diego or Silicon Valley or Austin, Texas feel like today, you know, or the Research Triangle in North Carolina. Everything is happening, everything is new, everything is getting built. By 1722, Boston was the #1 town in British North America. It was #3 as a port in the entire British Empire. This was one of the places to be, shipbuilding, others. And we made medical breakthroughs, like on smallpox, and the area just south of Boston, Situate, was the #3 shipbuilding port in the British Empire. This was some place, and it all had happened in 90 years. And so it was all green field for Boston at the beginning. But then it hit the 1730s, 1740s, 1750s, and 60s, stagnation, competition with New York and Philadelphia. I mean, Ben Franklin was born here and got out of town about 1725, 1726, and went to Philadelphia. That sort of competition of Boston versus other towns. And it was the stagnation that we had was part of why the revolution grew to such a intense size in Boston in the 1760s and 70s. There were an awful lot of laid-off sailors and people who had worked on ships and shipbuilding and that sort of thing. And it was Sam Adams and Paul Revere and others who put together what was an innovative network of people, Sons of Liberty and the other Minutemen and others, that led to the revolution. And at the moment of the greatest place in Boston's history at that time was also the moment of decline. 1776, the British were forced to evacuate. The farmers around Boston had defeated the most powerful army in the world, and this place was the first place that had independence. George Washington, was based in Cambridge and taking on the British and doing it. And at that moment, 85% of the population of Boston had either left or died in 4 years. And so the question became, it was a ghost town. Not unlike what happened after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. Would you stay or go? Would the place come back? And the place came back by a whole set of innovations. They developed the first textile manufacturing up the Charles River in Waltham and then in Lowell. The China trade developed from here. how could Boston figure out what the British hadn't been able to figure out, what people would buy in China. By the 1820s, Boston was not only one of the leading ports in the United States, but owned most of the shipping and most of the captains out of New York's port. That's where the idea of the Yankees come from, right? And Boston was really that port until the 1850s. And then again, at the moment that we're at our height in the Boston area, we invented the clipper ships. Donald Mackay was the Bill Gates of the 1850s. Everybody in the world in a writing capacity had heard about these ships that were built, and they were built in Boston Harbor, in East Boston, at the shipyards, and in Chelsea, and up the river in Medford. And these were the fastest ships ever to sail the sea then, or since then, were built right here, doing 450, 500 miles a day, which was incredible, and shaving off time to get to the gold fields in California by a third. The Boston ships did it, and there were some incredible races and that sort of thing. And at that same time, 1857, a recession hit, and all of a sudden, the steamships, which had been slower and couldn't carry as much cargo, were found that they could do some things which made them more efficient, and then Boston lost its cutting edge, its innovation. It lost its clipper ships. And so the area reinvented itself in the 1860s. From sailing ships, we went into textiles to shoes. Half the shoes sold in the United States, and about 40% of the shoes sold in Latin America came out of the greater Boston area. The telephone was invented here by Alexander Graham Bell. The bicycle craze of the 80s and 90s started right here in Boston with Columbia Bike and Colonel Pope. And literary-wise, it was the Athens of America. This was the media capital for magazines and for other things. The Pledge of Allegiance was written here in the 1890s. All this sort of writing and literature that Boston was known for. Then starting about 1910, when AT&T, which had been based in Boston and used MIT for its telephone labs for developing it, moved to New York City, 1915, 1920, the area began to slide into stagnation again. And gradually the textiles and the shoes and the others were lost to other places in the United States, other places in the world. And only starting in the 1940s or 50s did the area start to come back, but it was still in a decline, stagnated state. But in the 1950s to 1980s, electronics, as it was called, and Route 128, which was the Silicon Valley of the 50s and 60s, began to really take off. And the mainframe computers and the mini computers and others that were huge companies of the 70s and 80s, and sort of went belly up in the early 90s, were what the area was known for. But continuing into the 90s, the mutual funds, the biotech that was founded in this area and others take us off. So I'm not going into detail, but I'm probably going into more detail than I should. But 4 huge waves that have taken this area from the peak to an area that has unemployment and lots of extra sail lofts and lots of extra wharfs, or lots of old manufacturing plants, some of which are still right on Broadway and Main Street here. This is Boston. Let's move on. So what we did, we put together these hundreds of innovations in a database. We took 60 innovations to try to see what is it that's made this area be so innovative. And we went into detail on 60, drawn from all the different eras from the 1630s up to 2006 at the time. And some from social innovation, some from infotech, some from life sciences. And we looked at the different theories that people have either suggested in writing or talked with us about and said, you know, this area is innovative because it's got Harvard and MIT. No, it's innovative because it has 8 research universities. No, it's because it's always had good kindergarten to 12 schooling in the area. No, it's innovative because it's had a lot of immigration, like New York, and immigrants bring new ideas and criticize different things. No, we're innovative because we've got so much federal funding for healthcare. Or no, we're, there's mass education, it's the Puritan ethic, it's the wars and depressions outside, it's because we had been a big port. All these different ideas. We looked at each of the 60 cases and rated them and said, what led this innovation to happen here and at the particular time that it happened here? Why didn't it happen some other place in the world or some other place in the country? And so out of that, we came up with 5 drivers that have led Boston to be innovative over time. The first is entrepreneurship, and you might say, well, that's sort of the same thing as innovation. It's Alexander Graham Bell, or it's King Gillette who invented the safety razor, or it's Fanny Farmer who invented the new form of cooking with measurable cups and spoons and stuff, which was her thing over in Back Bay. So it's the entrepreneur. Well, we found that you need to have entrepreneurship in spades for this area to be innovative. That's true. But what else? Second one is that the entrepreneur has worked pretty closely with a number of other people across silos, sometimes in their own silo, but outside of their own company or institution. And that there's been a cluster usually of people competing with each other to make this thing happen. So the steam shovel was invented just south of Boston, in Canton, Massachusetts. What was it? Well, Paul Revere had started a copper foundry there, the first copper foundry in the United States. And there were all these little metal shops with tinkerers and ironmongers and others in that area who were working on it. And the guy, William Otis, who invented the steam shovel, went from place to place and said, I'm trying to solve this problem. What can you do to help me use ropes to lift up this really heavy mechanical sort of shovel thing? And he found enough around that copper works that there were 5 or 6. It couldn't have happened with only 1 or 2, that wasn't enough, but you needed to have a whole cluster. The other thing is, this area's been good on local demand. When something's invented, there's usually enough people in this area who will buy that product to make it work at least at the very beginning, which is what an entrepreneur needs. So Dan Bricklin, who in 1979 invented the first killer software application, which was called VisiCalc, we now call it Excel, which Apple was looking for, what is it that's going to lead people to want to have a computer at home, a personal computer? Because if it's only typewriting or word processing, you could have an IBM that had word processing in it. Why would people want it? People sort of said, I do that at the office, I don't do it at home. That was the psychology of the late 70s. Well, Bricklin, through the Boston Computer Society, was able to sell all of his VisiCalc things to people, and Apple heard about it, and they came together, and VisiCalc and Apple really worked together in 1979, 1980, and with it, the personal computer began to take off, so that by 1981, Time Magazine had the personal computer as the man of the year. Local demand then. Without that Boston Computer Society, Bricklin wouldn't have gotten going. Somebody else might have done it, but it happened to be Bricklin and it happened to be here. The last one on that is local funding. Boston, from its very earliest time, was settled by wealthier people because they happened to be Puritans who believed in taking on the established way of the Church of England at the time. And venture capital and banking and finance has always been big in this city. That local funding made it possible for King Gillette to start the safety razor. Might not have happened in Philadelphia, might not have happened in Chicago. And the last is, we've been good at figuring out national and global demand. Back in the 1640s, John Winthrop, who was the first governor, he and a number of other people came up with the idea of, why don't we sell what we have around here, which is codfish, and sell the cheap grades to the new plantations that were just getting founded in the British West Indies, which had just been taken from Spain, for plantations to sell to slaves there. And it was figuring that out, not a very positive or progressive thing, mind you, I'm certainly aware of it. It was selling that salt codfish and bringing back the sugar or molasses from those sugar plantations, which led Boston to become a center for a number of things that it's been till fairly recently, which was rum making for hundreds of years, and sugar and candy and Necco and all these, little fudge companies as you go up to the North Shore, local and national demand. So the 5 of these taken together are pretty interesting. This is over the 9 eras of the history. The dark blue is, they made it to the top 5 out of those 24 theories of why did a particular innovation happen in this area. And the light blue is they made it to number 6 through 10. And you can see that really from the reinvention of the 1640s through to the present, there's a lot of the same drivers, the high 5 as we call it, really made the difference over history. It wasn't just, gee, the research university, MIT and Harvard getting all these big research grants after World War II, like Stanford did with the Stanford Research Institute and others. This is something that goes way back. Hundreds of years before there was a research university, a big research university. Harvard College was a pretty small teaching institution. It looked like a community college by the standards of what we think about. So the high 5, as we call it, and then taking the high 5 together, we call it the bump and connect. And so it's these 5 drivers and which really have made the difference over time in driving the ability to invent the biotech influx that happened in this Cambridge area in the 1980s and 1990s, or drove the telephone invention and the invention of electric power stations, which became GE but was founded in Lynn here and that sort of thing. Bump and connect. Those sort of planned meetings that you might have, those sort of random things that you happen to run into somebody and you're thinking about something and they've got a solution for you that just is totally outside of your realm that you happen to be talking with somebody about. That's that bump and connect. And that there's also some money around, there's some intellectual property, patent lawyers around, and that people working in a sort of a close proximity with a lot of social and professional networking. And the perfect example, though we probably have a couple of other perfect examples in our stable here, is Kendall Square. So I'd like to take you, and a nickname for Kendall Square, of course, is because of biotech is Genetown, but there's an awful lot of companies, including Google, including Akamai, including lots and lots that aren't that. So let's look just for a second, if we move ahead here. Back in the mid-1990s, a very interesting book was written comparing 128 with Silicon Valley. And the book came out in favor of Silicon Valley, saying the reason why Silicon Valley is what it is that there's a lot of bumping and connecting, and there's a lot more horizontal sort of connections between people rather than people reporting up and down the chain of command. And that that's why Silicon Valley has the sort of innovation economy that vanquished Route 128. Now, we feel that there's some great companies in Silicon Valley, and there's some great companies, Google is in both, as you can see, it's right in the middle. Though it might be a little bit bigger in Mountain View than here, I think, but who knows. That Boston came back. Yeah, it didn't get the personal computer. There's a lot of times that when you have waves of innovation, it doesn't mean that you're going to keep the companies, that you're going to keep every single variation of what comes out of it. So Boston bet on the wrong horse. It bet on the mini computer in digital equipment, which was this huge company that many of you may have worked for that was based in Maynard. If it was 15 or 20 years ago, is no more, and the same with Prime Computer and Data General and the others. So, but moving ahead then, let's keep this in mind as we take a look at Kendall Square itself and drill right down through the layers of history right in this particular location, or at least within a couple of blocks of where you are. This is going to take us back. The red doesn't come out that well. Can we douse the lights just for a second? And just see whether it does? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Well, you can see it only a little bit better. But in any case, speak about innovation. You know, starting the country is a pretty big innovation. At least, I mean, it's only one that changes the nation. I suppose it's changed the world. So the British, as some of you know, went by sea from Boston over to the swampy area here, and we're right down around here in this red box here. And they marched right by here on their way out to Lexington to try to get those rabble-rousers, Sam Adams and John Hancock and the others, arrested back on April 18th and 19th in 1775. And then the British were chased the afternoon of the 19th of April all the way back here. So this area over here is really sacred turf for innovation. I mean, the United States wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the British getting landed by mistake in the swamp here rather than in the hard area. And so the troops that had to fight that day for the British had been left in about a foot or two of mud and seawater and had these wet feet and wet boots all day and had to fight in them. So anyhow, sacred turf. But it wasn't very innovative after that. We're going to take the story up. This is about 20 years later in 1795. The engineers of that time built what was the longest bridge in North America. And that was from, it's about where Longfellow Bridge is now. It's called the West Boston Bridge, all the way from Boston over to Cambridge. Now, you might not think that that was big, but at the time, nobody had built a bridge across the Mississippi, much less the Hudson. And it led the area, why don't we take this one further step here. It led this area over here, Leechmere's Point, and then we're just off to the left over here where what's now Kendall Square is, to start to develop a little bit, and streets went through. Let's take a look at how the area looked in 1830. Here's the West Boston Bridge, and you can see over here there's Broadway, and there's Main Street, and Hampshire Street going up that way. And the swamp is still here, but the roads have been built. Well, in any case, and there's a canal that came in over here. This is just about 10 years before, this is right after the railroad was invented, and about 10 years before the first railroad in this area. Let's take a look a little bit what happens. First is, in the 1840s, this guy Elias Howe invents the sewing machine in Central Square, just about 5 blocks up here. And then an inventor from Worcester moves into this area, a guy named Edward Kendall, who starts a Kendall Boiler Works. If you take a look on the corner of 3rd and Binney Street, there still is on the side of a red brick building there, something that says Kendall Boiler Works. And Kendall boilers at the time were the new energy source, taking over from the water-driven mills. And Kendall Boiler Works is about where the Kendall building is, just down the block on the other side of the street. Kendall himself is an interesting guy. He was born in about 1818, when the first big canals were the way that innovation was spread. The Erie Canal hadn't been started, but there was the Middlesex Canal here. And he lived to be the man who was the first person to step out of the subway in 1912 when it was opened at Kendall Station at the age of 91 or 92. Sort of a man bridging everything getting invented not too far from where he built his boiler works and stuff like that. And the station was named after him. There's some nice pictures of him from 1912 and the naming of the station. it's a name that nobody knows who Kendall was. Anyhow, he was a guy, and he was a guy who made fabulous amounts of money on one of the latest things in the area. But I want to take you to somebody else who's probably better known by a few in the area, a guy named Colonel Theodore Dodge. As you can see, he's a very meek, unimposing sort of guy. Colonel Dodge will start what's now these buildings that are in One Kendall Square, where the beer works are, and the Blue Room is right in the middle here, and a number of other buildings. Dodge was a lawyer and a militarist. He went to Prussia, worked under Bismarck in Prussia, and learned and tried to dress like a Prussian officer would, and came back in 1861 and said to Lincoln, "I know how to train an army. I'm the sort of person who you should put in charge." Well, he only was able to get a job as a colonel. He lost his leg in the Battle of Gettysburg, and he looked for something else to do. He was a lawyer, a patent lawyer, and he came to this area, and in a box factory that was just across the street over here, called Page Box, he found out about this invention. And this invention that he was looking at was a machine that had several hundred moving parts, was much too expensive to produce something, but had invented something which was a great use, which is a fire hose. In the 1854 Boston and 1855 New York City developed the first professional fire companies with steam-driven wagons and stuff. And this machine that he was looking at was able to take rubber. Rubber had just been vulcanized in Woburn, Massachusetts by a guy named Goodyear. You've probably heard of him. And Dodge knew about him and knew about the vulcanization. So taking the rubber and taking the outside, which was the textile manufacturing, the cotton, and putting it together so you had something that you could pull pretty easily, being a hose, and making that hose one which, with the rubber on the inside, didn't leak water. And it revolutionized how fires were fought. That made a huge difference, and you'll hear many stories about the big Chicago fire of 1872 and the big Boston fire of 1872. Well, this is about 3 or 4 years later, but a number of cities burned down about every 5 or 10 years. These hoses really made a difference. And that was invented really on what's a block away from you over here. And Boston Woven Hose was the name of what it did. Here's Boston Woven Hose in its first days. That old canal from 1810 was here. And then also making this the place to be, there was a railroad line that still goes through this very area and crosses over the BU Bridge. And right next to it, there was a rubber manufacturing plant, and there was the Cambridge rolling mills for steel for Kendall's boiler makers. Here's American Rubber Company over here. And so the things all came together. You know that thing that I've been talking about the bump and connect? Well, you had the patent lawyer. He hired somebody from Central Square, Robert Cowan, who was a tinkerer and inventor, and reduced the number of moving parts from hundreds down to about 40 or 50. And with that, the invention became commercially successful. And so Boston Woven Hose became a fixture, one of those driving, innovative technological companies from Cambridge at the time. They did both the rubber hoses and also belting, conveyor belts for machines, and if you couldn't have a factory without machines that were pulling things around, and those conveyor belts needed to be well done with rubber. He and Robert Cowan really developed that. Then here it is. They developed the first inner tube for the bike. Colonel Pope had invented the first American-made bike, the Columbia bike, and the safety bike, which didn't have the big front wheel. And inner tubes, given they didn't have paved roads at the time, really made the difference in those tires beginning to last. And it was the relationship between Boston Woven Hose, and Pope Manufacturing, Columbia Bike, that really made the difference in the bike craze taking off in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s. And here, Pope's bikes ran on Vim tires, which were the sort of Michelin tires for bikes of the 1890s. This is from a stunt that Boston Woven Hose did for the Washington, D.C. market at the time. So again, whether it's the revolution or inventing the fire hose, and then we go on, the automobile, Boston was one of the places that vied with Detroit in terms of was there going to be an auto manufacturer. And the first convertible tops on cars were invented by Boston Woven Hose, made out of rubber. And as suburbs developed in 1910, 1920, the garden hose was developed and patents here. The black tube, the garage air hose, other things. I mean, it may not, you know, it's not the most popular thing in the world at that time, but the automobile was big, and some of these things happening as part of it. It was time and again a company that looked for what was going to be the breakthrough that really propelled this company to stay up at the cutting edge with the others. This is a picture, a drawing from the 1920s. By then there are planes flying overhead, or at least allegedly, that somebody drew it in. And by the 1940s, they invented something which made the conveyor belts in factories work particularly well. It was such a hot item that the Soviets, the Russian government, tried to get access to it so that they could develop their World War II plants to be at the same level as the American plants. And the Pentagon, which had just gotten built, said, put the kibosh on that and said, no, you're not allowed into Boston Woven Hose. I mean, you know, think about that, a woven hose company being top secret, really. But on the next block to you. Okay, so this area had always been a center for soap making, and the king of that, really, was Lever Brothers, which employed a score of thousands of employees on the next block here, where Draper Labs is now, and these buildings went down into across the street from it's where the Stata Center and some of the others are now. Lever Brothers, owned by the British, was the #1 manufacturer of soap in the United States, and not innovative particularly, but on these sites. It came down in 1962 because this area was supposed to be the site for NASA to do its mission control to go to the moon. Kennedy was assassinated. Johnson in 1964 moved the center to be in Houston. And so this area was left with all these buildings having been taken down. Across the street, there was a wooden building at the time, building 38, where radar, a lot of the, Britain had developed the first radar, but brought it here because their factories were being bombed in World War II. And Raytheon, which was founded in this area as well as other companies, made the breakthroughs that made radar something that could be produced for the Allies and helped to win the war. It's where the Stata Center is now. Also in this area, a professor at MIT, Charles Stark Draper, he invented the inertial guidance system, which allowed planes to land during storms in the 1930s, and developed it after World War II, taking over some of the old space that by the 60s and 70s that Lever Brothers had been in. And Draper's systems were the ones that guided the American astronauts to the moon and back. And of course, in the 1980s, the area started to get redeveloped. Boston Woven Hose went out of business around 1980, and the area was redeveloped. And Genzyme, which was a company that had a couple of employees, had been founded in Chinatown, moved over here. And this area of what's now One Kendall began to be where other things, the Whitehead Institute, which was one of the, perhaps the main place of the 3 sites for the Human Genome Project, Avonex, which developed the cure for, or the best drug that's been developed to help MS sufferers, and Amgen, and a huge number of other biotech companies, so that the area now is seen as the place for other companies to look. There's just an article in the papers and online this morning about London trying to copy Cambridge's biotech industry. And of course, there's some great infotech, you folks, as well as Akamai, which is just on the next block on the other side. Akamai, which has developed online streaming, and this is their mission control room, actually copied on the Houston version. 20% of all emails go through Akamai routers around the world, and it's all run from the corner of Broadway and Galileo Street. So over time, well, and actually this is the Koch Institute as it's being built over at MIT on Carlton Street, just about a block and a half from here. This is the latest in biotech engineering to try to get this, half of the places for biologists, half for engineers, and there's a corridor that tries to bring them together so that the bump and connect is a little bit stronger within the lab space. So as you think about why this area has been innovative, Kendall Square, or why the larger region has been innovative over time, it's that bump and connect, we feel, that really makes the difference. And it's that informal way of connecting that we think both within your own firm, and Google has been that in Mountain View, and there's the effort to bring to inculcate the same culture here. We think that there's a bit of a science about it, and it's not just Google that's done really well by it, but a lot of different places and companies over time, whether it's the American Revolution, or whether it's fire hoses, or inventing vulcanization of rubber, or whether it's, we could go on and on. It's quite a list just for a little area that, and every area has something to be proud of. But this area of Boston and Cambridge, Greater Boston as we call it, or Greater Cambridge as the mayor of Cambridge likes to call it, is a place where great innovations have happened, and it's obviously one that we think that if the trend continues and we protect the same sort of culture, that it will stay that way into the future. So that's sort of the overview, and I want to open it up and see what folks have to say and about it, and questions that you might have. Thanks. This is awesome. Yeah.
So just recognizing that there are so many different factors that contribute to the innovation, and that public leadership, elected officials are just a piece of that, in different people's visions for the city. I am curious to see if you think there is a mayor or a governor in the whole history of the past 400 years basically that has been most influential or had like a real vision that that changed the game sort of for Boston, maybe these lower peaks or.
What we found, and I'm somebody who actually comes out of the public sector at times and worked in a partnership in city government and have worked at state levels and stuff. What we found is that government is a supporting factor, an important one. Without public education, without a good police force, but it's not, the government can help. But most of this is really outside of the government's purview. It has much more to do, we think, with that government needs to create an environment that brings together people from different silos. And that could be just guiding the real estate industry a little bit to try to get different firms together in different places, or appealing to companies to do that. You can't do it without money. You can't do it without government. We don't even have the universities up in the top 5, you might have noticed. And if you look at the back cover of our report, we've got 2 university presidents on there, the provost of Harvard, the chancellor of MIT and stuff like that. So we're a little bit edgy on this, but we think that this is really how innovation happens not only here, but clearly also in other places. So yes, there have been a few public officials who have really done some dramatic things. John Winthrop, who was an early governor, certainly by staying here rather than saying, let's just go south to Connecticut or Rhode Island, or let's give up, go back to England, clearly was one. There's a mayor in the 1890s, Mayor Nathan, forgetting his name, who was the one that led the drive to have put in the first subway in the Western Hemisphere, the second subway in the world after London. Boston was the first place to have electric trolleys. I mean, going from horse-drawn trolleys here to electric trolleys really made it, big breakthroughs and that sort of thing. He did some of that. He enabled some of that. Certainly things like Governor Patrick's trying to have $1 billion to loan to biotech industry, but of course Governor Schwarzenegger is trying to do the same thing there. A lot of times they're matched by other places, but the short answer is government is really a supporter when it's of innovation in creating the context and keeping it from being, this sort of environment, the gangs of New York sort of environment in the 1860s that, it's hard to get much done. So, yeah.
So, what you're looking at are mostly local factors. Are these booms of innovation, when one is happening in Boston, is that correlated with one happening in New York or Chicago? Is it?
Not all the time, no. I mean, and one looks right now, for example, there's some headlines, I don't know, 4 or 5 days ago, that Boston's economy is doing better in this recession than a lot of other cities in the United States. And some of that is because of biotech and the infotech work that's happened in this area. And as things are successful here, there's an awful lot that happens in smaller places around the region. So, I think that a lot of times innovation has, obviously if you have something like the Depression that leads to financial crisis and leads to other things like in the 1930s, it's going to lead to stagnation here as well as other places. But, California did not have as bad a depression. In fact, that's why so many people went from the Midwest to California in the 1930s. Because there were things that are happening that were pulling it out a lot faster. So a lot of times people today start to feel that if you look at the world economy, instead of looking at nation states, that it's better to look at city states. It's better to look at how Singapore is doing, or Shanghai as opposed to all of China, or Shanghai and Beijing and Canton as opposed to all of China. And it's interesting to look at San Diego and how it's doing as opposed to how Chicago or other city states are doing. So it's a different perspective than saying, clearly there are national trends that affect things, but there's an awful lot to particular areas having a lot more innovation than other areas do. So we lend our explanation to some of that.
I could see it being the national economy tanks, so everywhere is in trouble, but I could also see if innovation isn't happening in Boston, then maybe those people are going to move to New York. So some innovations could be a zero-sum game. Is it correlated?
Or to Silicon Valley, or to, right, yeah. So it can be. On the other hand, it's really played on an international level. You look at their number of the bio labs in Singapore that have been built in the last 3 or 4 years are attracting a good deal of investment by Kendall Square based companies, Genzyme and Biogen IDIC and Millennium and others. So, and certainly Google is in an international market rather than a national market. My original question is, gee, why locate Google in Boston and Cambridge? And our feeling is that at least some of this sort of analysis is the sort of thing that makes a difference as people look at, you know, what the centers of innovation are right now in 2000. So, yeah.
What are some of your main sources when doing research for the Kendall Square area? Does it really vary, or is there one main?
Pretty varied. Harvard Business School's Baker Library has a history of a number of companies going back 50 or 100 years in this area. So it has the Boston Woven Hose corporate archives. So you can go back and check, gee, who was it who invented this? What are the patents? How did the company do? Those sorts of things. There's also, though, we worked with the Beal companies, which wanted us to do the study and was looking at how to brand One Kendall or rebrand One Kendall. And they happened to own a number of things which had been part of Boston Woven Hose at one time, even though they had just bought the site in 2005, 2006. So, and otherwise, we had been studying for 8 or 10 years all these biotech companies, which are part of the innovation economy and growth of the area in the 1990s and now. And that came into play. It's like, oh, Whitehead was founded at One Kendall, and and Susan Whitehead is on our trustees, so the other connections. So really, the good thing was that we've been studying lots of different little pieces over time, and then sometimes that can come into play when you're trying to research one particular area. We've done the same thing with 3 or 4 other parts of Boston, smaller neighborhoods that people think, they're not historical. And it's like, it's pretty interesting when you get into that, in part because the region has done an awful lot over time. But it's interesting. It's also interesting because it's not till the 1940s that MIT really has that much to do with this innovation history. I mean, it wasn't that Kendall settled here or that Colonel Dodge settled here because of MIT. MIT at the time was started in 1861, 1865, and was in Back Bay, about where Louis is, in Back Bay, until 1915. So it's not that it was the university that drove it. However, it certainly is very important in terms of people wanting to stay in the area. People graduating from MIT, maybe some of you, or Harvard or other places, it's like, it's close by. It makes it easy. Yeah. So.
Great, so it looks like we're right at time, but that was great. So interesting.
Good.